March in Pinebrook County. The last snow still clung to school roofs when 13-year-old Nola Gamble entered the courthouse in a baby blue cardigan. She smiled at the photographers. For Nola, this was not justice. It was rehearsal. The world wanted to believe her story, a tragic accident by a gifted girl tinkering with chemical experiments. Her teacher collapsed. She cried for help, and everyone called it misjudged chemistry. But investigators found too much certainty in her calm, too many practiced lines in her interviews. She said she was just curious, but curiosity does not check toxicity at exact dosages. There was one file she could not control, one that hid between server autosaves. A single email draft that detailed every cold step. It would surface at trial like a ghost of her handwriting. By the time the judge said her name for the last time, that schoolgirl composure would be gone. The trial would not end with applause, but with the undeniable proof that this 13-year-old knew exactly what she was doing. The Pinebrook County Courthouse stood at the center of town, like a monument to small-town order. Its granite steps had been worn smooth by generations of defendants and witnesses, and inside the main courtroom, dark oak panels absorbed sound and light in equal measure. This morning, the gallery was packed. Local reporters filled the back rows, their notebooks ready. Community members who had known Mrs. Rachel Winters sat in clusters, their faces drawn with grief and confusion. And at the defense table sat Nola Gamble, her small hands folded neatly in front of her. Orange jumpsuit, vivid against the muted tones of the room. The white undershirt beneath showed at her collar and cuffs. She looked impossibly young. Judge Evelyn Lawrence entered through the side door, her black robes swishing as she climbed to the bench. Lawrence was a woman in her late 50s with steel grey hair pulled back severely and eyes that had seen every variety of human failing. She had presided over Pinebrook County Superior Court for 12 years and had developed an instinct for performance. She settled into her chair and surveyed the room with the calm authority of someone who knew that truth, however buried, eventually surfaced. The bailiff called the court to order. All rise. The Honorable Judge Evelyn Lawrence presiding. Nola stood with her public defender, a harried-looking man named Thomas Brenner, who specialized in juvenile cases. Brenner was in his early 40s, balding, with the tired eyes of someone who had defended too many guilty children. He placed a hand on Nola's shoulder, a gesture meant to convey protection and support. Nola turned her face toward the cameras in the gallery, her expression carefully arranged into wide-eyed innocence. She let her lower lip tremble just slightly. The clerk read the charges. Nola Gamble, you are charged with reckless endangerment resulting in grave bodily harm to Rachel Winters. How do you plead? Nola spoke in a voice barely above a whisper, soft and trembling. Not guilty, Your Honor. She paused, then added with perfect timing, I would never hurt Mrs. Winters. She was my favorite teacher. Several people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. Judge Lawrence watched Nola with an unreadable expression, then nodded to the clerk. The plea is entered. She set a trial date and addressed the attorneys regarding preliminary motions. At the prosecution table, District Attorney Dina Carell sat with her co-counsel reviewing notes. Corell was a woman in her mid-40s, with dark hair streaked with grey and the lean intensity of a long-distance runner. She had prosecuted hundreds of cases in her 15-year career, but this one was different. This one involved a child. A child who, Corell believed, had committed a calculated act of violence and then hidden behind her age like a shield. Corell had spent weeks reviewing the evidence, and the more she learned about Nola Gamble, the more convinced she became that this was not an accident. The girl was brilliant, everyone agreed on that. She had tested into gifted programs, won science fairs, impressed every teacher she encountered. But there was something else. Something the adults around her had missed or chosen to ignore. Nola was also manipulative, calculating, and utterly convinced of her own superiority. The investigation had begun on a cold February morning when Rachel Winters collapsed in her classroom at Pinebrook Middle School. Mrs. Winters was a beloved English teacher in her late 50s, known for her patience and her ability to inspire even reluctant students. That morning, she had been grading papers at her desk during lunch period when Nola Gamble entered the room carrying a steaming mug. "Mrs. Winters," Nola had said, "I brought you some tea. I know you like chamomile." Mrs. Winters had looked up and smiled, touched by the gesture. "Thank you, Nola. That is very thoughtful." Nola had set the mug on the desk and lingered, chatting about an upcoming assignment. Mrs. Winters had taken a few sips of the tea while they talked. Within minutes, she began to feel ill. Nausea, dizziness, a burning sensation in her throat. She tried to stand and collapsed. Nola had run into the hallway screaming for help, her performance of panic so convincing that the first responders on scene had comforted her, told her it was not her fault, that Mrs. Winters must have had a medical emergency. But Mrs. Winters did not have a medical emergency. Toxicology tests revealed the presence of thallium sulfate in her system, a highly toxic compound used in certain laboratory applications. The dosage was not quite lethal, but it was close. Mrs. Winters spent 2 weeks in intensive care, her hair falling out in clumps, her organs shutting down one by one. She survived, but the damage was permanent. She would never teach again. Detective Rowan Vale had been assigned to the case. Vale was a meticulous investigator in her late 30s with a reputation for patience and thoroughness. She had arrived at the school within hours of the incident and began the painstaking work of documenting everything. The classroom was treated as a crime scene. Photographs were taken from every angle. The tea mug was carefully bagged and labeled, the chain of custody documented with obsessive precision. Vale interviewed every student and teacher who had been in the building that day. Nola had been interviewed twice, once at the school with her parents present and once at the police station. Both times she had told the same story. She had been working on a chemistry experiment at home, trying to create a color-changing solution to demonstrate pH levels. She had brought some of the mixture to school in a small bottle, intending to show Mrs. Winters her progress. She must have accidentally grabbed the wrong bottle that morning when she made the tea. She had no idea it contained anything dangerous. She was horrified that Mrs. Winters had been hurt. She would never intentionally harm anyone. The story was plausible, almost, but Vale had noticed inconsistencies. Nola's affect during the interviews was too controlled, too practiced. She cried at appropriate moments, but the tears seemed calculated rather than spontaneous. And when Vale asked technical questions about the chemistry experiment, Nola's answers were vague and contradictory. Vale requested a search warrant for the Gamble home. The search had been conducted on a Saturday morning. Vale and 2 other officers arriving at the modest colonial where Nola lived with her parents. Nola's mother had answered the door, her face pale and strained. She had been cooperative, showing the officers to Nola's bedroom while Nola watched from the hallway, her expression unreadable. The bedroom was neat, almost to the point of obsession. Books were arranged by height on the shelves. Clothing hung in the closet, organized by color. The desk was clear, except for a laptop and a small collection of pens arranged in a ceramic holder. Vale had photographed everything before beginning the search. In the desk drawers, she found school notebooks, each labeled with subject and date. She flipped through them methodically. Math homework, history notes, sketches of molecular structures. Then she found the chemistry notebook. It was identical to the others on the outside, but inside, the margins were filled with calculations, dilution ratios, solubility rates, toxicity thresholds, and scattered among the numbers were small drawings, angry faces, a crude sketch of a woman with X's over her eyes, the word unfair written over and over in increasingly aggressive script. Vale bagged the notebook as evidence. In the closet, she found a locked box. Nola's mother provided the key, her hands shaking. Inside was a collection of items that seemed innocuous at first glance. A school ID card, a lanyard with a magnetic keycard attached, science fair ribbons. But the keycard made Vale pause. It was labeled with the Pinebrook Middle School logo and a student access code. Back at the station, Vale cross-referenced the keycard number with the school's security logs. The card belonged to Nola and had been used to access the science lab's chemical storage room on 3 separate occasions in the month before Mrs. Winters collapsed. The last access had been 2 days before the incident. Vale contacted the school's chemistry teacher, a man named Douglas Fenton. Fenton was a nervous individual in his 60s who took lab safety extremely seriously. When Vale asked him about student access to the chemical storage room, he became visibly agitated. "Students are not supposed to have access to that room," he said. "Only faculty. The keycard system is supposed to prevent unauthorized entry. But someone with a faculty keycard could grant a student temporary access," Vale suggested. Fenton hesitated. "Technically, yes, if a teacher signs out chemicals for a supervised student project. But we have protocols, logs, everything is supposed to be documented." Vale asked to see the logs. Fenton produced a leather-bound ledger where every chemical withdrawal was supposed to be recorded with date, substance, quantity, and signature. Vale scanned the entries for the relevant dates. There were several withdrawals logged in Nola's name, all signed by Fenton. Sodium hydroxide for a pH experiment, copper sulfate for crystal growth, but there was no entry for thallium sulfate. Fenton stared at the log, his face growing pale. "I did not sign these." He pointed to the signatures. "This is not my handwriting." Vale felt a cold certainty settle over her. She asked Fenton to check the chemical inventory. He disappeared into the storage room and emerged 10 minutes later, his hands shaking. "A bottle of thallium sulfate is missing. We use it for certain demonstration experiments, but we have strict protocols. It should be here." The case was building piece by piece. Vale obtained a warrant to search Nola's school locker and her Chromebook. The locker contained typical student items, books and binders, and a few personal effects. But tucked inside a textbook was a printout from a chemical database. Pages detailing the properties of thallium compounds, their toxicity, their symptoms, their lethal dosages. The Chromebook was more complicated. School-issued Chromebooks were monitored and had content filters, but they also had autosave features that backed up documents to the school's cloud server. The technology department retrieved the device and began the process of examining its contents. What they found would become the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. But that discovery would come later, after weeks of forensic analysis. The trial began on a Tuesday in late March. The courtroom was even more crowded than it had been for the arraignment. News of the case had spread beyond Pinebrook County. A 13-year-old girl accused of poisoning her teacher. The story had elements that attracted media attention: the gifted child, the beloved teacher, the question of whether someone so young could be capable of such calculated cruelty. Dina Carell stood to deliver her opening statement. She approached the jury box. 12 citizens of Pinebrook County who had been selected after 2 days of voir dire. Carell had fought to seat a jury that could set aside sympathy for a child and focus on evidence. She had succeeded in assembling a group that seemed willing to do exactly that. "Ladies and gentlemen," Carell began, her voice clear and steady. "This case is about a young woman who committed a deliberate act of violence and then hid behind her age and her charm. Nola Gamble poisoned her teacher, Rachel Winters, using a toxic chemical she stole from her school's laboratory. She did this not in a moment of passion or confusion, but after careful planning and research. And when Mrs. Winters collapsed, Nola played the role of the horrified, innocent bystander, a role she had rehearsed and perfected." Carell outlined the evidence the state would present: the toxicology reports, the forged signatures in the chemical log, the calculations in Nola's notebook, the testimony of classmates who would describe Nola's rage after receiving a failing grade for plagiarism on an English paper, and finally, the digital evidence that would prove beyond any doubt that this was not an accident. Thomas Brenner delivered the defense opening with considerably less confidence. He argued that Nola was a child, a brilliant but socially awkward child who had made a terrible mistake. She had been conducting experiments at home, trying to impress her teachers, trying to prove herself worthy of the gifted programs she had been accepted into. She had accidentally mixed chemicals without understanding their properties. When Mrs. Winters became ill, Nola had been traumatized, paralyzed by guilt and fear. She was not a criminal. She was a child who needed help, not punishment. Nola sat at the defense table with her head bowed, her hands folded in her lap. She had been allowed to wear the baby blue cardigan over her orange jumpsuit for the opening statements, and she looked even younger than her 13 years. Occasionally, she would glance up at the jury with wide eyes, then quickly look away, as if overwhelmed. The prosecution called its first witness, one of the paramedics who had responded to the school on the day of the incident. He described finding Mrs. Winters unconscious on the classroom floor, her breathing shallow, her pupils dilated. He described Nola standing in the corner of the room, crying, saying over and over, "I did not mean to. I did not mean to." On cross-examination, Brenner asked, "Did my client seem genuinely distressed?" The paramedic nodded. "She seemed very upset, like any kid would be in that situation." Brenner let that answer sit with the jury. A child genuinely distressed by a terrible accident. But Carell was not finished. On redirect, she asked, "In your experience, do people who are genuinely distressed usually speak in complete, coherent sentences?" The paramedic considered. "Usually they are more fragmented, more incoherent. This girl, she was upset, but she was very controlled, very articulate." The medical testimony came next. The doctor who had treated Mrs. Winters in the emergency room described her symptoms, the rapid deterioration of her condition, the difficulty in diagnosing the cause until the toxicology results came back. Thallium poisoning was rare, he explained. It was not something they routinely tested for. By the time they identified the toxin, Mrs. Winters had already suffered significant organ damage. A toxicologist took the stand and explained the properties of thallium sulfate in excruciating detail. It was a heavy metal compound, odorless and tasteless when dissolved in liquid. It was extremely toxic, affecting the nervous system and causing a cascade of symptoms that could mimic other conditions. The lethal dose for an adult was approximately 1 gram. The amount found in Mrs. Winters' system had been 0.7 grams. Enough to cause severe harm, but not quite enough to kill. Carell asked, "Doctor, would a person administering this substance need to know the precise dosage to achieve that result?" The toxicologist nodded. Yes, too little and the victim would recover quickly with minimal symptoms. Too much and death would be rapid. The dosage Mrs. Winters received suggests someone calculated very carefully. Brenner objected, arguing speculation. Judge Lorenz sustained the objection, but the point had been made. The emotional center of the prosecution's case came when Rachel Winters herself took the stand. Mrs. Winters entered the courtroom slowly, supported by her adult daughter. She had lost significant weight, and her hair, just beginning to grow back, was patchy and thin. She moved like someone much older than her 58 years. The jury watched in visible distress as she was sworn in and took her seat. Carell approached gently. "Mrs. Winters, can you tell the jury about your relationship with the defendant?" Mrs. Winters spoke in a voice that was hoarse and strained. "Nola was my student. I had her in 8th grade English. She was very bright, very engaged. She wrote beautifully. I encouraged her work. Did something change in your relationship with Nola?" Mrs. Winters nodded slowly. In January, Nola submitted an essay for a major assignment. It was excellent, sophisticated beyond her years. But when I ran it through the plagiarism detection software we use, I discovered that significant portions had been copied from online sources without attribution. What did you do? I followed school policy. I gave her a failing grade on the assignment and reported the incident to the administration. I also scheduled a meeting with Nola and her parents to discuss academic integrity. How did Nola react? Mrs. Winters closed her eyes. She was furious. She insisted she had not plagiarized, that the ideas were hers, that I was persecuting her because I was jealous of her intelligence. Her parents tried to calm her down, but she became increasingly agitated. She said I had ruined her life, that she would make sure everyone knew how unfair I was. And approximately 3 weeks later, you collapsed in your classroom after drinking tea Nola had brought you. Yes. Mrs. Winters began to cry. I trusted her. When she brought me that tea, I thought it was her way of apologizing, of rebuilding our relationship. I never imagined a child could do something like this. Brenner's cross-examination was brief and uncomfortable. He tried to suggest that Mrs. Winters could not know for certain that Nola had poisoned the tea, that anyone could have tampered with it. But Mrs. Winters was unshakable. Nola brought me that tea. Nola handed it to me. There was no one else. The prosecution methodically built its case over the following days. Detective Vail testified about the investigation, the search of Nola's room, the forged signatures in the chemical log. A handwriting expert confirmed that the signatures were not written by Mr. Fenton, but showed characteristics consistent with Nola's handwriting. A fingerprint analyst testified that Nola's prints had been found on the chemical storage room door handle and on the missing bottle of thallium sulfate, which had eventually been recovered from a dumpster behind the school. Students who had been in Nola's English class testified about her reaction to the plagiarism accusation. A girl named Sarah Collins took the stand and described Nola's rage. She was screaming that Mrs. Winters had destroyed her chance at a scholarship, that Mrs. Winters was going to pay for what she had done. Another student, a boy named Marcus Chen, testified that Nola had approached him in the cafeteria a week before the incident and asked strange questions. She wanted to know if he knew anything about autopsies, about what tests they ran when someone died unexpectedly. Marcus had thought it was weird, but had not said anything at the time. Throughout all of this, Nola maintained her performance. She shook her head sadly during damaging testimony. She wiped away tears with the sleeve of her cardigan. She wrote notes on a legal pad, her handwriting round and childish. When the cameras panned to her, she kept her chin down and her eyes wide, the picture of wounded innocence. But Judge Lawrence was watching, and she was not convinced. She had seen manipulative defendants before, and she recognized the signs. The calculated timing of the tears, the glances toward the jury to gauge their reaction, the way Nola would adjust her performance based on what seemed to be working. During a recess, Brenner pulled Nola aside in the consultation room adjacent to the courtroom. He sat across from her, his expression strained. "Nola, you need to stop performing for the cameras." Nola blinked at him, her expression innocent. "I do not know what you mean, Mr. Brenner." Brenner leaned forward, his voice low and urgent. "The jury is not stupid. They can see that you are playing a role. You need to show genuine emotion, real remorse." Nola's eyes hardened for just a moment before she smoothed her expression back into softness. "I am showing remorse. I feel terrible about what happened to Mrs. Winters." "Do you?" Brenner asked. "Because from where I am sitting, you seem more concerned with how you look than with the fact that a woman nearly died." Nola stared at him, and for a brief second, Brenner saw something cold and calculating behind her eyes. Then she dropped her gaze, and her voice became small. "I am sorry if I am not reacting the right way. I am just scared. I do not want to go to prison." Brenner sighed, exhausted. "I am doing everything I can to prevent that, Nola. But you need to help me. You need to let the jury see that you understand the gravity of what has happened." Nola nodded meekly. "I understand." But she did not understand. Or perhaps she understood perfectly and simply did not care. For Nola, the trial was a game, a test of her ability to manipulate and deceive. She believed she was smarter than everyone in the courtroom, smarter than the prosecutor, smarter than the judge, certainly smarter than the jury. She would say the right things, make the right expressions, and they would acquit her. They had to, because she was 13 and brilliant, and the world had always bent to accommodate her. The forensic evidence was presented with painstaking detail. Dr. Elizabeth Park, a forensic chemist, testified about the analysis of the tea mug recovered from Mrs. Winters' classroom. The mug had been carefully sealed and transported to the state crime lab where Dr. Park had conducted a battery of tests. She had found residual traces of thallium sulfate consistent with the compound missing from the school laboratory. She had also found Nola's fingerprints on the handle of the mug. Brenner tried to argue that the fingerprints proved nothing, that Nola could have touched the mug at any time. But Carell countered with testimony from the school custodian who confirmed that all mugs in the faculty room were washed daily. The fingerprints had to have been placed on the mug the day of the incident. The prosecution then turned to the digital evidence, and this was where the case would be won or lost. Carell called Martin Torres, a digital forensics expert who worked with the state police. Torres was a young man in his early 30s with the enthusiastic energy of someone who loved his work. He explained to the jury how school-issued Chromebooks functioned, how they automatically saved documents to cloud servers, how deleted files could often be recovered through those backups. "Mr. Torres," Carell asked, "were you asked to examine a Chromebook issued to the defendant?" "Yes. I received the device from Detective Vale with a request to recover any deleted files or documents that might be relevant to the investigation." "What did you find?" Torres pulled out a thick folder of printouts. "I found multiple documents, including schoolwork, emails, and internet search history. But the most significant finding was a draft email that had been deleted from the trash folder." "Can you explain how you recovered this deleted email?" Torres nodded, warming to the subject. "When a user deletes an email in the Gmail system used by the school, it first goes to the trash folder. If it is deleted from trash, it is removed from the user's view, but the data is not immediately erased from Google's servers. Additionally, the school district's Chromebook management system creates automatic backups every 24 hours. I was able to retrieve the email from a backup that had been created the night before the incident. Was there any indication that the defendant was aware this backup system existed?" Torres shook his head. "Based on her internet search history, she researched how to permanently delete emails from Gmail, but did not search for information about the district backup system. I do not believe she knew the file could be recovered." The courtroom was silent. Every person in the gallery leaned forward, waiting. Carell approached the witness stand. "Mr. Torres, can you describe this email draft for the jury?" Torres pulled out a printout. The email was addressed to a student named Kayla Morrison. The subject line read, "Tomorrow she learns her lesson." The body of the email contained a detailed plan for administering a toxic substance to an unnamed target. There was also an attachment, a document that appeared to be copied from a chemistry database detailing the toxicity of thallium compounds. Carell introduced the printout as an exhibit. "Your Honor, the state would like to introduce Exhibit 14, the recovered email draft." Brenner objected strenuously. "Your Honor, the authenticity of this document is questionable. We have no way to verify that my client actually wrote this email." Judge Lawrence looked at Torres. "Can you establish that the defendant authored this document?" Torres nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. The metadata embedded in the file includes the username associated with the account that created it, which is Nola Gamble's school email address. It also includes a timestamp showing when the document was created and last modified. Additionally, we lifted fingerprints from the Chromebook keyboard that match the defendant's prints." "The objection is overruled," Judge Lawrence said. "The exhibit is admitted." Brenner sat down heavily, his face pale. Nola stared at the printout being passed to the jury, her expression frozen. Carell continued, "Mr. Torres, can you read the timestamp for when this email was created?" Torres consulted his notes. "The email was created at 7:42 in the morning on February 14th. It was last modified at 7:56. it was deleted at 8:03. And what time did the incident occur at the school? According to the police report, Mrs. Winters collapsed at approximately 12:15 that afternoon. So this email was written the morning of the incident, approximately 4.5 hours before Mrs. Winters was poisoned. Yes. The jury was staring at Nola now, their expressions ranging from shock to disgust. Nola kept her eyes down, her hands clenched into small fists on the table. Carell took a breath. "Mr. Torres, with the court's permission, I would like you to read the text of the email aloud." Torres looked at Judge Lawrence, who nodded. He cleared his throat and began to read, his voice filling the silent courtroom. "Tomorrow she learns her lesson. I have been planning this for weeks, and I am not going to chicken out now. The compound is in my locker, hidden in a water bottle. It dissolves completely, so she will not taste anything. Mix in just enough to work fast, 2 drops, or she will notice before it is too late. She will start feeling sick during 4th period. By the time they figure out what happened, it will be too late to reverse all the damage. Everyone will know not to mess with me again. She thinks she can ruin my future and get away with it. She is wrong." The words hung in the air like a curse. Several people in the gallery gasped audibly. Mrs. Winters' daughter began to sob. One of the jurors, an older woman, put her hand over her mouth. Nola's face had gone white. Her small fists were trembling. She looked toward her mother, who was sitting in the front row of the gallery, her face frozen in horror. But her mother was not looking at her. Her mother was staring at the floor, tears streaming down her face. Carell let the silence stretch for a long moment. Then she asked, "Mr. Torres, was there an attachment to this email?" "Yes, a document titled Thallium Toxicity Data. It contains detailed information about the lethal dosage, symptoms, and time to onset for thallium poisoning. The document appears to have been copied from the National Institutes of Health chemical database." Carell had the attachment displayed on a screen for the jury. It was a chart showing dosage calculations, symptom timelines, and treatment protocols. Handwritten notes in the margins matched Nola's handwriting. 0.7 grams for delayed effect. Not lethal, but close. Will cause permanent damage. The prosecution rested. There was nothing more to say. The email had said it all. Brenner stood for his cross-examination, but his heart was not in it. He tried to argue that the email could have been written by someone else using Nola's account, but Torres dismantled that theory, with technical explanations about password security and login records. He tried to suggest that the email was a creative writing exercise, a dark fiction that Nola had been working on. But the specificity of the details, the chemical formulas, the timeline that matched the actual incident made that explanation absurd. When Brenner finally sat down, he looked defeated. He knew the case was lost. Nola sat motionless at the defense table, her carefully constructed mask finally cracking. Her eyes were wide and glassy, her breathing shallow. For the first time since the trial began, she looked genuinely afraid. Judge Lawrence called a recess. The jury filed out, several of them looking visibly shaken. The gallery erupted in whispered conversations. Nola was led back to the holding cell by the bailiff, her legs unsteady. In the holding cell, Nola sat on the narrow bench and stared at the concrete wall. Her mind was racing. They had found the email. the email she had been so careful to delete. She had researched how to permanently erase files. She had emptied the trash, cleared the cache, done everything the internet had told her to do. But she had not known about the backup system. She had not anticipated that. For the first time, Nola felt the weight of what she had done pressing down on her. Not remorse, not yet, but fear. Real, visceral fear. She was going to be convicted. She was going to prison. Her perfect future, the scholarships and the accolades and the admiration she had always believed were her birthright, were gone. When the trial resumed, the defense presented its case. Brenner called a child psychologist, who testified that Nola's emotional development was not commensurate with her intellectual abilities, that she struggled with impulse control and understanding consequences. But under cross-examination, Carell forced the psychologist to admit that the email demonstrated extensive planning and awareness of consequences. This was not an impulsive act. Brenner called character witnesses, teachers and neighbors who described Nola as polite and helpful. But their testimony felt hollow in light of the email. Polite children do not calculate lethal dosages. The defense rested without calling Nola to the stand. Brenner knew that putting her up for cross-examination would be disastrous. Closing arguments were brief. Carell reminded the jury of the evidence, the forged signatures, the stolen chemical, the calculations in the notebook, and most damning of all, the email. Tomorrow she learns her lesson. Those words, Carell said, are a confession. They show premeditation, malice, and a complete understanding of what the defendant was doing. Brenner argued for leniency. Nola is a child, he said. A child who made a terrible mistake. She deserves a chance at rehabilitation, not decades in prison. But the jury was not convinced. They deliberated for 3 hours and returned with a verdict. Guilty of first-degree attempted murder. Guilty of reckless endangerment. Guilty on all counts. Nola sat frozen as the verdict was read. She did not cry. She did not react. She simply stared straight ahead, her face blank. Judge Lorenz scheduled the sentencing hearing for the following week. The day of sentencing arrived. The courtroom was once again packed. Nola entered in her orange jumpsuit, the baby blue cardigan left behind. She looked smaller without it, more vulnerable. She took her seat at the defense table and folded her hands in her lap, but the performance was gone. She could not muster the energy to pretend anymore. Mrs. Winter's daughter, a woman named Claire Winters Hall, approached the podium to deliver a victim impact statement. She was in her early 30s, with her mother's gentle features and a voice that shook with emotion. My mother is the kindest person I have ever known, Claire began. She dedicated her life to teaching, to helping children discover their potential. She believed in second chances. She believed in forgiveness. She believed in Nola Gamble. Claire paused, wiping her eyes. My mother will never teach again. The poison damaged her kidneys, her liver, her nervous system. She is in constant pain. She has lost her hair, her energy, her independence. She can barely walk across a room without becoming exhausted. And the worst part is the betrayal. My mother trusted Nola. She cared about her. And Nola repaid that trust by poisoning her. Claire looked directly at Nola. You are 13 years old. You have your whole life ahead of you. My mother is 58, and her life, as she knew it, is over. I hope you understand what you have taken from her, from us, from yourself." Claire returned to her seat, supported by her father. Nola stared at the table, her face blotched red. Then Judge Lawrence spoke. She removed her glasses and set them on the bench, her gaze fixed on Nola. "Miss Gamble, this court has watched you over the course of this trial. We have watched you perform. We have watched you cry on cue, widen your eyes for the cameras, whisper your lines with perfect timing. You have treated these proceedings as if they were a school play, and you were the star." Nola looked up, her eyes meeting the judge's for the first time. Judge Lawrence continued, her voice gaining strength. "But your own words have exposed the truth. The email you wrote, the email you thought you had deleted, reveals who you truly are. You are not a child who made a mistake. You are not a victim of poor impulse control. You are a young woman who planned, researched, and executed a deliberate act of violence against a woman who had shown you nothing but kindness." The judge leaned forward. "You wrote that Mrs. Winters would learn her lesson. You calculated the dosage with precision. You knew exactly what you were doing. You knew the poison would cause permanent damage. You wanted it to cause permanent damage. And then you handed her that tea with a smile and watched her drink it." Nola's lower lip was trembling. Her hands were shaking. When Mrs. Winters collapsed, Judge Lawrence said, "You did not call for help immediately. You stood there and watched. Multiple witnesses testified that you waited several seconds before screaming for assistance. Were you waiting to see if your plan had worked? Were you savoring the moment?" Judge Lawrence's voice rose. "And then you performed. You cried. You told the paramedics you did not mean to. You played the role of the traumatized child so convincingly that adults, trained professionals, comforted you. They told you it was not your fault, but it was your fault. You planned it. You executed it. You tried to hide it." The judge sat back, her expression one of profound disappointment. "You are 13 years old, and you have demonstrated a level of calculation and cruelty that is chilling. You poisoned a woman who believed in you, who wanted to help you succeed. You did it not in a moment of passion, but after weeks of planning. And you did it for the pettiest of reasons. Because she gave you a failing grade. Because she held you accountable for plagiarism." Judge Lawrence picked up a document from her desk. "The law requires me to consider your age in sentencing, and I have considered it. But I have also considered the evidence. I have considered the email where you wrote, 'Everyone will know not to mess with me again.' I have considered the toxicity chart you annotated with your own calculations. I have considered the fact that you showed no remorse, no empathy, no recognition of the enormity of what you had done." She looked directly at Nola. "Age is not an eraser, Miss Gamble. Understanding makes it premeditation. And you understood. Your intelligence, the very quality you pride yourself on, is what makes your crime so indefensible. You knew what you were doing. You knew it was wrong. And you did it anyway." Judge Lawrence's voice dropped to a near whisper, somehow more menacing than a shout. "You wanted Mrs. Winters to suffer. You wanted her to be punished for daring to question your brilliance. You wanted to prove that you were smarter than everyone else, that you could commit the perfect crime and get away with it. But you were not as smart as you thought you were. And now you will spend decades contemplating that failure. Nola's face was wet with tears, real tears this time, born not of remorse but of the realization that her life was over. The judge read from the sentencing document. This court sentences you to 30 years in the custody of the Vermont Department of Corrections. You will be held in a juvenile facility until you reach the age of majority, at which point you will be transferred to an adult correctional facility. You will be eligible for parole after serving 20 years, but I will recommend to the parole board that you serve the full sentence. Judge Lawrence set down the paper and looked at Nola one last time. Let this case remind us that innocence is not measured by age, but by empathy. You had none. You have none. Perhaps in the decades to come, you will develop some. But that is for you to discover in the silence of your cell. She brought down the gavel. This court is adjourned. Nola was led away by the bailiff, her legs barely supporting her. The baby blue cardigan had slipped from her shoulders and fallen to the floor. No one picked it up. She walked past her mother, who was sobbing in the front row, but she did not look at her. She could not. In the corridor outside the courtroom, reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, but Nola kept her head down, her hands cuffed in front of her, her orange jumpsuit vivid against the grey walls. The trial became a national story. News outlets ran features on child culpability, on the dangers of unchecked narcissism, on the failures of the education system to identify warning signs. Legal experts debated whether the sentence was appropriate for a 13-year-old. Some argued it was too harsh. Others argued it was exactly right. Pinebrook Middle School overhauled its chemical storage protocols. All student access was revoked. A new security system was installed. The school board issued a formal apology to Mrs. Winters and established a scholarship in her name for students pursuing teaching careers. Mrs. Winters slowly recovered, though she would never return to full health. She moved in with her daughter and spent her days reading, writing letters to former students, and trying to make peace with what had happened. She never spoke publicly about Nola. Nola was transferred to a juvenile detention facility in northern Vermont. She was placed in a single cell and given access to educational materials. She read voraciously, wrote in a journal, and maintained the fiction that she was still the smartest person in the room. But at night, alone in the darkness, she thought about the email. The email that had destroyed her. The email she had written in a moment of arrogant certainty, never imagining it could be recovered. Detective Vale kept a copy of the email on her desk, a reminder of the importance of thoroughness. She had seen many cases in her career, but this one stayed with her. The coldness of it, the calculation, the utter absence of empathy. Dina Carell moved on to other cases, but the Gamble trial remained one of her most significant victories. She had proven that age was not a defense against premeditation, that intelligence could be evidence of guilt rather than innocence. And in her chambers, Judge Lawrence sat alone for a long time after the sentencing. She thought about Nola's face when the email had been read aloud, the moment the mask had finally cracked. She thought about the words, "Tomorrow she learns her lesson." The arrogance, the certainty, the complete failure to recognize another human being's worth. She thought about the fact that Nola was 13, that she would spend the next 2 decades in prison, that her life, as she had imagined it, was over before it had truly begun. And she felt no satisfaction, only a deep sadness that a child could be so broken, so devoid of the basic empathy that made us human. But justice had been served. The truth had been spoken. And Nola Gamble, the girl who had believed she was untouchable, had learned the hardest lesson of all. You cannot delete the truth. It always survives.